the empire was reborn and broken. In a single lifetime, Justinian poured gold and blood into reconquests aimed at restoring his status to equal that of Rome's ancient emperors. He succeeded, briefly. But how did triumph turn into weakness? His victories came with hidden costs, economic strain, the so-called Justinianic Plague around 542, and frontiers in the east were left perilously vulnerable. What seemed to be the proudest achievement of the 6th century may have actually signaled the start of Byzantium's decline. Let's examine why striving to recreate the glory of Rome ended up weakening it from within. You'll see how fleeting glory disturbed the balance of a state designed for endurance, and how it all began with one ruler who believed he could revive Rome from the dead. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Justinian was that ruler, the emperor who dreamed of restoring Rome. From the beginning, he envisioned a revival of the empire on the grand scale of Augustus and Trajan. This wasn't merely administration. It was a statement that the declining Byzantine state could once again become a global power. You have to understand what that truly meant. For Justinian, revival meant more than military conquests. It involved reshaping the very image of the empire. Armies moved west to reclaim provinces, while at home, monumental buildings rose to remind people of God's blessing over the emperor. Walking through Constantinople during his reign, you would see marble colonnades, broad streets, and gleaming churches. It was designed to evoke the golden age of Rome, breathing new life into the east. The issue was that the empire he inherited could scarcely afford such ventures. The treasury strained to finance prolonged wars. Tax systems pressed subjects close to rebellion. Provinces scarred by earlier disasters needed stability, not expansion. Yet Justinian pressed on as if the empire could be reconstructed all at once. His ambition pushed the state along a fragile path, offering glory, but risking collapse at every turn. Initially, amazement overshadowed concern. Chroniclers regarded victories as blessings from heaven. Buildings appeared so rapidly that people claimed only God could have hastened the work. For instance, after the Nika Riots ravaged much of Constantinople, Justinian constructed the new Hagia Sophia in just 5 years. To contemporaries, walking through its soaring arches and light-filled dome was proof that divine favor was with this emperor. He was not only ruling, but also transforming the world as if guided by a higher power. However, consider it like building a palace on cracked stone. The facades may impress, but the foundation cannot bear the weight forever. Justinian was stacking triumphs on already weakened foundations, an overgrown bureaucracy, a fragile economy, and borders in constant need of defense. Citizens saw monuments that promised eternity, yet perceptive observers could already feel the strain beneath. At its core was Justinian's assertion of continuity. He claimed to be the heir of Rome's greatest rulers. He spoke of destiny, of a Christian empire rising to restore what had been lost. After years of contraction and insecurity, people wanted to believe. They accepted the idea that glory could return, that their own generation would witness God's plan unfold through their emperor. Nevertheless, the costs remained undeniable. Campaigns into Africa and Italy thrilled the capital, but drained the treasury. Cathedrals inspired awe, but consumed vast quantities of timber, stone, gold, and an army of workers. Each project demanded resources that Byzantium could scarcely afford. Behind the ceremony in marble lay a state stretched thinner than ever. Yet on the streets of Constantinople, the ordinary citizen saw prosperity. New colonnades shining in the sun, and news that distant lands once lost were back under imperial rule. For many, belief itself became a source of strength. A convinced population endured taxation, sent sons into the army, and accepted burdens because they trusted that Rome had indeed returned. Perception created its own stability, so long as people remained convinced. But money must be counted, and soldiers fed. Officials scoured the provinces for levies, and local populations waited for the constant knock of tax collectors. Farmers gave grain, towns provided coin, and garrisons were stretched thin across vast distances. Glory abroad magnified hardship at home. Every victory required new sacrifices, and the empire began to feel the weight of holding its own revived grandeur. So Justinian's reign quickly turned into a balancing act. To sustain his image of divine authority, he had to maintain a steady stream of victories and a constant flow of buildings. But each success bit deeper into the empire's reserves. His triumphs and his troubles were now bound together. The higher he built, the heavier the burden became. This is the paradox that defined him. The dazzling emperor who built churches and conquered kingdoms was also the ruler who pushed his empire to the point of overreach. What seemed to his contemporaries like the glorious rebirth of Rome, we now see as a fragile shell hiding cracks beneath its surface. For them, it was a golden age. For us, it hints at decline masked as glory. Yet at this stage, most had no reason to suspect how delicate it truly was. The monuments appeared solid. The armies looked victorious. The emperor's power felt unassailable. Then, almost without warning, this carefully maintained illusion faced its first real test, not on the battlefield nor in the treasury, but right within the capital itself. Because within Justinian's own city, in a place of games and entertainment, anger erupted, nearly sweeping him from the throne. It began not with foreign invasion or barbarian attack, but with the roar of the circus crowd. "5 days of chaos brought Byzantium closer to collapse than any invading army. This was the Nika Riots of 532, when Justinian's rule nearly fell apart under the pressure of popular revolt within his own capital. For almost a week, Constantinople was ablaze, and the emperor's grand project teetered on the brink of ruin. The blues and the greens were central to this story. On the surface, they appeared as rival racing factions, passionate supporters of their charioteers. But these groups extended beyond mere sports clubs. They served as social networks, neighborhood identifiers, and even political outlets. Living in Constantinople without being drawn into one side or the other was impossible, and their rivalries colored everyday life. Yet, as rare as it was, when they cast aside their rivalry and united, their influence could sweep through the city like a storm. That is precisely what happened in January 532. A dispute over prisoners after a race escalated into anger over taxes, corruption, and the harshness of Justinian's rule. With the hippodrome situated directly beside the imperial palace, the emperor could plainly hear the shouts from the stands. What began as protest chants grew into the cry, "Nika," the Greek word for victory. When that word echoed through the arena, entertainment turned into outright rebellion. The movement spilt onto the streets almost instantly. Crowds surged out of the hippodrome and directed their fury at the capital itself. fires set by rioters swept through markets and homes. Buildings associated with imperial authority became targets. Smoke and rubble engulfed once bustling avenues. In a matter of hours, Constantinople looked less like the imperial capital and more like a city under siege, reduced to scorched ruins by its own citizens. The violence intensified with an even more symbolic and perilous act. The mob proclaimed a new emperor, elevating a noble with a legitimate claim to the throne. Whoever he was, his crowning demonstrated that the throne could be challenged from within. For an emperor who believed he had divine favor, this rival figure posed a deadly threat. Justinian's advisors urged him to flee, to cross the Bosporus and abandon Constantinople. The emperor himself hesitated, his claim to universal power appearing fatally hollow. Inside the palace, pressure increased. Family members and officials pleaded for safety rather than dignity. Guards whispered that they could not hold the walls forever. In that paralyzing atmosphere, the decision seemed inevitable. Flight, and with it, the end of Justinian's reign. It was Theodora who broke the hesitation. She declared that abandoning the throne would bring shame deeper than death. Procopius records her saying she would rather die in the imperial purple than live with its loss. Her words strengthened Justinian's resolve. Against the advice of many around him, he chose to stay. From that moment, the situation changed. Justinian ordered his commanders to counterattack. He summoned two generals who would be crucial during his reign: Belisarius, already recognized for his military talent, and Narses, an experienced court official with strategic expertise. Together, they devised a plan to trap the rioters in their stronghold. The counterattack was swift. Soldiers sealed the rioters inside the hippodrome. What had started as a stadium filled with chants of victory became a prison. Imperial troops advanced quickly, cutting down the trapped crowd in brutal close quarters. Procopius, our primary source for the event, stated that between 30,000 and 40,000 people were killed. Even if his figure is debated, the massacre remains one of the bloodiest suppressions in the city's history. When the violence ended, silence replaced the noise. Bodies filled the arena where cheers once echoed. The rival claimant disappeared, and imperial banners once again flew unchallenged. Justinian and Theodora had not only survived, they had crushed the rebellion entirely. However, their survival came at a terrible cost, with thousands of deaths tarnishing the empire's reputation. This victory exposed the fragile balance of power in the Byzantine Empire. Just days earlier, the emperor had contemplated fleeing like a hunted, ordinary man. Now he sat confidently on his throne. However, his authority was based not on consensus or affection, but on fear and force. The Nika Riots revealed how delicate divine claims could seem when the populace rebelled. 1 week of defiance had brought the empire dangerously close to collapse. The riots also scarred the city itself. Fires reduced large parts of Constantinople to ash. Baths, streets, monuments, and entire districts lay in ruins. Homeless people gathered in whatever shelter remained. The imperial capital, which Justinian aimed to transform into a vision of Rome reborn, instead appeared as a city ravaged by conquest. For an emperor who governed as much through image as via decree, this devastation was both a wound and a chance. Rebuilding became vital, not only to restore basic function, but to reaffirm power. The extent of destruction required more than patchwork repairs. If the riots had called Justinian's legitimacy into question, the rebuilt city would need to declare it beyond doubt loudly. Just as his generals had crushed rebellion with swords, his architects would now erase it with stone. The paradox of the Nika Riots is that they nearly ended Justinian's reign, but also strengthened his rule. The violence frightened the populace into obedience, but intimidation alone could not uphold legitimacy. To survive, he needed spectacle, something that reminded citizens that God's hand still rested on the throne. He would respond to ruin with a project merging faith, politics, and architecture into a single act of recovery. Surviving the riot secured Justinian's throne, but it also established a pattern. When unrest shook the empire, the emperor's response was to invest in spectacle. From the chaos of 532 would emerge his greatest attempt to demonstrate that divine favor and imperial power still united in his person. What followed was not merely a building, but a stone declaration that endures to this day. After the smoke of the riots cleared, Justinian set about remaking Constantinople's heart, not with words, but with stone. At the center of this effort stood his most audacious work, the Hagia Sophia, and the symbol of power it represented. The choice of site carried profound significance. The earlier church had been destroyed during the Nika Riots, its blackened ruins a stark reminder of imperial weakness. By building a new structure on the same ground, Justinian aimed to overwrite that memory. It replaced the church lost in the riots and was designed to erase the memory of fragility with a dome that no one could ignore. On the surface, the Hagia Sophia was a house of worship, honoring God and serving as the empire's chief cathedral. But its political purpose was clear. Every column and marble wall conveyed to citizens that their ruler remained unshaken. Religion and legitimacy were intertwined within a single building, crafted to persuade everyone, from ordinary subjects to foreign envoys, that God had restored majesty to the throne. Speed helped emphasize the point. The Hagia Sophia rose in just over 5 years, astonishing given that projects of its size usually took decades, sometimes even generations. To contemporaries, the rapid construction seemed miraculous, a sign that divine favor had blessed Justinian. To modern observers, its quick pace indicates a sense of urgency, a ruler eager to restore legitimacy swiftly before doubts about his authority could take hold. Think of it as the skyscraper of the 6th century, built not just to inspire, but to assert authority. Its dome, seemingly floating above the skyline, was visible from far across the city. To citizens who had witnessed fire and death only months earlier, the site now declared stability. For them, standing beneath that roof meant seeing weakness turned into permanence. And for skeptics, it served as a warning. The emperor could rebuild faster than any crowd could tear down. Yet, this spectacle came at a staggering cost. Laborers were summoned from distant provinces, stone was cut from remote quarries, and wealth was diverted from soldiers' pay and provincial repairs. Contemporary reports even describe the patriarch's throne as being made of silver, said to weigh around 40,000 pounds. Porphyry columns and panes of colored glass heightened the grandeur. Each detail reassured observers of imperial wealth, but drained reserves already strained by war, rebuilding, and taxation. This made the Hagia Sophia both a triumph and a burden. Walk through its vast interior, with shafts of daylight scattering colored light across marble, and it is impossible not to feel awe. That awe was carefully cultivated. Worshippers experienced holy majesty alongside imperial power. But beyond its walls, officials counted coins, generals begged for payrolls, and regions asked for relief from taxes. For them, magnificence was also debt. Justinian believed that grandeur secured obedience better than moderation. In the Hagia Sophia, he achieved grandeur beyond precedent. Pilgrims traveled miles simply to stand in its hall. Foreign envoys returned to their courts, describing a city whose ruler seemed chosen by heaven itself. In this sense, the project succeeded. The rebellion was erased through spectacle, replaced by the claim of eternal Rome renewed in Christian form. But the spectacle was never free. Every panel of marble imported from across the empire conveyed a message of reach and unity, but also represented a line from the treasury unreturned. Every mosaic shimmering high above, believers offered reassurance bought with coin, not spent defending the frontiers. One man's legitimacy was secured by shifting costs onto the shoulders of his army and his people. Still, there is no denying the impact. Few rulers in history have wielded architecture as a direct tool of legitimacy. Hagia Sophia became a stage, throne, and sermon all at once. For anyone entering beneath its arching dome, state and church blended seamlessly into theater. The rebellion faded from memory. Splendor replaced smoke. So when you stand beneath that dome today, remember, it was meant to do more than lift prayers. It was statecraft in stone. Its glittering surfaces promised the endurance of the empire, but its hidden foundations reflected the weight of debt. And that tension explains what followed. If one building could pull so heavily on the empire's finances, imagine the strains when Justinian turned his gaze outward. To rebuild Rome, not through marble, but through conquest, meant risking more than coin. It meant testing the strength of armies and provinces across distant seas, with victories that at first seemed effortless, but carried their own costs to come. How do you topple an empire in a single campaign? For Justinian, the answer came with astonishing swiftness on the shores of North Africa. The target was the Vandal kingdom, a power that had once humiliated Rome by seizing its provinces, severing its vital grain supply, and even sacking the eternal city itself. For nearly a century, the Vandals had held this territory and controlled the Western Mediterranean. Defeating them seemed an immense challenge. Yet, when Belisarius led his expedition under Justinian's orders, the kingdom collapsed more rapidly than anyone expected. Within months, battles that might have lasted for years were brought to a swift conclusion. The Vandal rulers were captured, their armies scattered. Belisarius advanced with a relatively small expeditionary force and swiftly took the Vandals, presenting Justinian with a significant victory. Africa was restored to imperial control. For a state that declared itself Rome's heir, this was more than a victory. It appeared to erase nearly a century of humiliations in a single stroke. The speed of the campaign made a strong impression. Could reclaiming the Western world really be this simple? A province thought lost forever was once again under imperial banners. News spread quickly to Constantinople, where celebrations broke out. Citizens praised the emperor's brilliance, and parades celebrated the return to Africa. The Vandals, once a lasting scar in Rome's history, were gone almost overnight. And if Africa could be taken so quickly, why not Italy? Why not Rome itself? It was a risky moment. Think of a gambler winning big on the first roll of dice. Confidence increases, and risk seems invisible. Africa gave Byzantium that same thrill. Territories long surrendered to barbarian kings now appeared ready to return. The story of decline seemed to have been reversed, as if fate itself had shifted. The people of Constantinople fed the illusion. New coins carried messages of victory. Monuments displayed inscriptions to Justinian's glory. Poets compared him to Augustus, as if the empire had been reborn. To ordinary citizens, Reconquest no longer seemed a distant rumor, but a straightforward march towards a restored Roman world. Yet even here, early cracks appeared. The Vandal kingdom was already weakened by civil strife, making conquest seem straightforward. Although Belisarius quickly gained control, the victory did not fully stabilize Africa. The native Berber population, long subjugated under Vandal rule, rose to power. They raided the coastlines and unsettled the very territory Byzantium claimed to hold. Africa's fall might have seemed effortless in battle, but its occupation required soldiers, administrators, tax collectors, and constant vigilance. The glory was swift. The burden lasted much longer. There were also strategic costs. By striking west across the seas, Justinian diverted men, money, and attention away from the eastern frontier. That border, with Persia looming beyond, proved far more perilous in the long run. In hindsight, it is clear. Africa dazzled on a map, but Persia remained the rival capable of striking at the empire's heart. At the time, however, celebrations blinded both emperor and people to that danger. In the early 530s, few dared to consider risks. Belisarius's victory shone too brightly. In less than a year, the long-lost provinces had returned to imperial control. Grain shipments once again departed from North African ports and sailed eastward. Taxes filled the imperial treasury. Roman law and administration reappeared in cities where they had vanished for nearly a century. For officials and citizens alike, it felt as though the old pattern of governance had been stitched back together almost overnight. The symbolism mattered as much as the material gain. Africa had once been the cornerstone of the Western Roman economy, feeding cities across the Mediterranean. To recover it so easily, Justinian's prestige was boosted beyond measure. The psychological shock matched the grain and revenue now flowing east. This proved that restoration wasn't a fantasy. It was happening. But the emperor drew the wrong conclusion. He saw Africa's ease not as an exception, but as a path forward. Future wars, he believed, would unfold in the same pattern. Quick campaigns, rapid victories, jubilant homecomings. He mistook luck for inevitability. In doing so, he set the empire on a trajectory of overreach. At the time, such doubts found little voice. How could anyone argue against such a sudden, total win? Propaganda drowned out hesitation. Triumphs in the capital displayed banners, music, and the emperor was hailed as divinely chosen. Just as the Hagia Sophia symbolized resilience after the riots, Africa projected inevitability across a whole continent. People did not see overextension. They saw destiny. Nevertheless, occupation in Africa steadily increased its costs. Soldiers stationed in remote provinces defended against revolts and raids. Supplying them overseas required continuous expenditure. Tax demands were heavy, and local governors had to balance the need for revenue against the potential for unrest in the countryside. From an outside perspective, the empire simply appeared larger. From within, Africa drained endless energy, coin, and workforce. This was the trap. Africa's rapid fall was a triumph because it clearly demonstrated strength. However, it was also a trap, as it led Byzantium to believe that reconquest was easy, that the Roman map could be restored without cost. The illusion was strong enough to eliminate caution and silence the few voices calling for restraint. Why stop with Africa when the western provinces still awaited? For Justinian, Italy became the next target. By the mid-530s, the idea of capturing Rome no longer seemed daring. It appeared unavoidable. If the Vandals' kingdom had collapsed in less than a year, then surely the Gothic kingdom in Italy, would follow the same pattern. But unlike the Vandals, the Goths were not fragile or divided enough to shatter in a single blow. They would resist for decades. The campaigns in Italy would drag Byzantium through famine, devastation, and exhaustion. The victory that followed would seem dazzling on paper, but the costs would poison the very empire that claimed it. The carefree triumph in Africa set the stage for what was to come next. The rapid fall of Africa convinced the court and citizens that reconquest might be easy, an illusion that would haunt later decisions. Taking Italy felt like reclaiming Rome's beating heart. But what if victory poisoned the empire itself? For Justinian, reconquering the peninsula promised more than land. It promised legitimacy. If Africa were a windfall, then Italy was the ultimate prize. This was not just another province. Rome's old capital had never lost its symbolic weight, and the Gothic kingdom that ruled it was seen as an intruder sitting inside the cradle of Roman greatness. To truly revive the empire's splendor, Italy had to be recaptured. Initially, the campaign unfolded with confidence. Belisarius, Justinian's trusted commander from the African triumph, landed troops in Sicily. The island fell swiftly. From there, his army crossed to the mainland, besieging Naples until the city surrendered. March after march, the imperial reach extended northward. By 540, the Gothic capital at Ravenna yielded to Byzantine forces. On the maps in Constantinople, the view was dazzling. Africa restored, Italy reclaimed, the East still secure. To contemporary writers, it seemed Rome itself had been reborn. But the victories concealed a harsher truth. Italy was not Africa. Ravaging the peninsula was not the same as sweeping aside the Vandals. What began as rapid progress turned into a brutal, protracted struggle lasting 20 years. Italy endured about 2 decades of campaigning, leaving its countryside in a state of devastation. This was not a swift restoration. It was a relentless cycle of sieges, famine, and scorched earth. The impact on civilians was devastating. Naples, battered by the siege, starved before it fell. Other towns were plundered in turn. Armies from both sides stripped the land bare. Gothic defenders demanded food, and Byzantine conquerors did the same. To the people, who controlled the city gates, mattered less than surviving another day of requisitions. In every season of fighting, trade declined, fields went untended, and famine worsened. The conflict did not end when Ravenna fell. Although the city's loss seemed decisive, the Goths grimly regrouped. They launched counteroffensives, regaining towns and stretching Byzantine forces thin. Belisarius would win ground, only to see it unravel a few years later. The constant setbacks drained Italy's resources. By the war's end, the population had plummeted, infrastructure had been shattered, and regions that once thrived had been emptied of those capable of rebuilding. Even Procopius, our primary source for these wars, recorded this change. At first, his writing was full of praise for Belisarius and Justinian, celebrating swift conquests and divine favor. But as the years wore on, his tone shifted. He grew bitter, filling page after page with accounts of starvation, massacres, and ruin. He once chronicled triumphs. Later, he chronicled decay. Reading him, you sense optimism fade into despair as Italy bled year after year. The irony is stark. Justinian aimed to reunite the empire, but his efforts tore Italy apart. To conquer Italy was to weaken it gradually. Rome's symbolic heart was reconnected to Byzantium, but the limbs that supported it were crippled. Across the countryside, famine spread. Cities that had traded for generations were left as gutted shells. Fields lay barren and abandoned. The Roman core had returned, but the body carrying it was broken. The economic burden was equally heavy. 2 decades of war meant paying troops, maintaining fleets, and draining gold from the treasury. Every siege in Italy required coins raised in the east. Soldiers once posted to defend Persia were redeployed to sieges at Naples or Florence. Fortresses that could have secured Syria instead rose along Italian roads. Administration struggled to distribute limited resources across vast distances. Meanwhile, Persia exploited the gap. While Justinian focused on his campaigns in the west, the Persians renewed their attacks across the Euphrates. Cities were burned, Syria was ravaged, and new defeats in the east marred Ravenna's supposed conquest glory. Additionally, in the same decade, a plague swept through the empire, draining both the workforce and wealth. Ravenna's fall in 540 seemed like a high point, but it also marked the moment when shadows grew thicker. As later historians often note, Justinian's peak was also his turning point. The paradox is evident. The Italian wars lasted 20 years, devastated entire provinces, yet were celebrated as victories. The empire expanded its territory, but at the expense of security. Fields lay bare, populations were scattered or slaughtered. To casual observers in Constantinople, banners still displayed triumphs. But for those living in Italy, Byzantium brought destruction rather than renewal. Within the empire's administration, the contradictions became more pronounced. The treasury strained, and the armies were overstretched. Procopius himself, once loyal in tone, began to assign blame, sometimes at Justinian, sometimes at Belisarius, for the bleeding that refused to cease. Over the course of 2 decades, the dream of a united empire turned into a nightmare for the land that Justinian most desired. Italy reveals more clearly than Africa the danger of Justinian's ambition. A symbolic prize was achieved, but the reality was devastation. The peninsula waned even as its map reverted to imperial colors. Stability in the east diminished, prestige in the west shaped policy, but at the cost of security elsewhere. Historians today refer to it as a poisoned victory. Byzantium reclaimed the province and Rome itself at a staggering cost. The toll of siege, plague, and constant campaigning fractured Italy for generations. The empire was larger in name, but weaker in blood and wealth. Justinian reached his moment of glory, but his triumph also planted the seeds of long-term decline. From an outside perspective, it seemed complete. Africa was secure, Italy had been restored, and architecture had been renewed in Constantinople. But step back, and you see the actual cost. Reunification seemed steady, but had left the empire strained, stretched, and vulnerable. While armies bled in Italy, another question loomed. Who was guarding the east? Justinian's gaze had been fixed on Rome's old lands, but the empire's eastern gates stood exposed, and enemies were circling. The dangers that unfolded on Justinian's eastern border revealed how even the strongest empire could never defend everywhere at once. This was the story of the unwatched frontier. In 531, not long after his reign began, Constantinople signed what became known as the so-called Perpetual Peace with Persia. The bargain was straightforward: a heavy payment of gold in return for quiet on the frontier. The deal bought time in the east, and Justinian used that time to move troops west. Yet time ran out. What he purchased was not peace, only a pause, and every pause eventually comes to an end. The Persian frontier was no ordinary border. It was the line where two great rivals pressed against each other, tested by centuries of conflict. Even in years of calm, suspicion ran deep. Fortresses stared each other down across the Euphrates, and scouts carried rumors of movement. For Justinian, who longed to win glory in Africa and Italy, the treaty seemed enough to free his hands. But the empire didn't keep spare armies waiting across Syria and Mesopotamia. Its defenses rested on the fragile hope that money could substitute for garrisons. That gamble collapsed when Persia struck again. With Justinian's main forces bogged down in the west, the Persians advanced into Byzantine territory and attacked with precision where defenses were weak. Their most devastating blow fell on Antioch, one of the empire's greatest eastern cities after Constantinople and Alexandria. This was a jewel of Syria, a center of trade, culture, and wealth. When its walls failed, Antioch was seized, sacked, and burned. The destruction shocked contemporaries across the Mediterranean, a clear signal that one of Byzantium's proudest metropolises was no longer safe. To understand the weight of this loss, you need to picture what Antioch was. It was a thriving hub, linking the empire to Asia, filled with markets that connected the Mediterranean and inland trade routes. Churches there had once displayed mosaics that glittered in colored light. Its people paid taxes, its workshops produced goods, and its location strengthened Byzantine presence deep in the east. When Persian soldiers reduced it to ruins, the impact was not only military, but also economic, spiritual, and psychological. News of Antioch's sack spread quickly. To the citizens of Constantinople, it conveyed a bitter message. While Ravenna and Rome were celebrated, Antioch burned. As triumphal processions proclaimed the empire reborn in the west, the east watched its people taken into captivity. Imperial pride in victory sat alongside dismay at helplessness. Antioch's fall revealed that Justinian's grand project told two stories simultaneously, one of banners raised and provinces won, and another of provinces burned because defenses had been stripped bare. You might compare it to a house fitted with new tiles and painted walls, while the front gate remains wide open. The outward appearance appears solid from afar, but enemies slip in through the very gap left unguarded. Africa and Italy were Justinian's grand decorations. The eastern frontier was his broken lock. Persia tested it, and they entered. This exposed the empire's geographical trap. The Byzantine state spanned two parts of the old Roman world, constantly forced to defend multiple fronts. Troops sent west meant fewer troops for the east. Fortresses repaired in Italy meant neglect along the Euphrates. It was not solely a personal failing of Justinian, but the reality of his empire's shape. Yet his ambitions heightened that disparity. He preferred conquest in older Roman lands over security, prestige over stability. The sack of Antioch became one of the lowest points of his reign because it starkly highlighted that trade-off. Almost simultaneously, Ravenna capitulated to Belisarius, while Antioch burned. Glory in Italy and devastation in Syria stood side by side. His vision of restoration seemed convincing when parades carried captives and banners into the city of Constantinople. But for subjects in the east, the face of rule was Persian ruin. Contemporary accounts preserve this dual memory. Procopius and other observers wrote of triumphs, but in hushed tones, they also described despair. Cities left in rubble, families made refugees, markets silenced. The propaganda carved into stone spoke of divine favor, but the rumors spreading from Antioch carried a darker truth, that the emperor's reach was stretched too far and his strength was divided on too many fronts. Economically, the effects extended beyond Syria. Trade routes connecting Asia to the Mediterranean faltered. Caravans broke off, tax flows declined, and revenues shrank just when Justinian needed them most. Wealth could not be accumulated in both directions simultaneously. When coin was diverted to sustain siege engines outside Florence or to feed soldiers holding Ravenna, there was less for garrisons in the east. Antioch's fall demonstrated that cities could be destroyed faster than wealth could be accumulated to replace them. For those who experienced it, the betrayal was deeply felt. Farmers, merchants, and priests alike had been expected to provide their grain, their coin, and their loyalty to Constantinople in exchange for the empire's protection. Yet when the Persians arrived, that protection vanished. What comfort was the Hagia Sophia to them when their churches lay in ashes? What did it matter that Africa was restored to imperial control if their sons were marched away in chains? The emperor's victories were weighed against their losses. The lesson was clear. Byzantium could not defend everywhere simultaneously. Victory in the west required sacrifices in the east, and securing one frontier often meant weakening another. Every conquest cast a shadow, and every celebration left silence elsewhere. In this case, the triumph in Italy was matched by the devastation of Antioch. The grander dream of restoration came at a cost borne directly by the eastern provinces. That is why contemporaries spoke of the sack of Antioch with such lasting impact. They saw not only the city's ruins, but also the failure of a promise. Glory was shared unevenly. For Constantinople, it was banners. For Syria, it was destruction. To Justinian, the empire appeared intact. To his people, it felt shattered. For ordinary folk on the eastern frontier, witnessing Antioch burn must have felt like a betrayal of the empire's promises, proof that pride had come at their expense. And even worse, after war and fire, there followed something even more relentless, something no general could defeat, a creeping disaster that would eventually reach the capital itself and bring the empire to its knees. The empire had endured riots, wars, and invasions, but in 542 it faced an enemy without banners or swords. This was the Justinianic Plague, often dated to that year, and it would break the machinery of empire more decisively than any barbarian army. It began quietly, arriving in harbor cities with cargoes of grain and goods that supplied Constantinople's markets. Carried by ships and traders across the Mediterranean, it crept inland until it reached the capital itself. Once there, it spread faster than officials could understand, overwhelming neighborhoods in days. Unlike wartime struggles, this catastrophe offered no battlefield and no chance for resistance. The devastation was immediate and shocking. Streets emptied almost overnight. Entire households vanished, leaving doors unopened and lamps unlit. Merchants disappeared, fields lay untouched, and tax receipts collapsed, so the state could no longer fund war or construction. On some days, so many bodies remained uncollected that officials ordered mass graves dug simply to clear the piles. Constantinople, once famed for its vibrance, now echoed only with the sound of carts hauling corpses. Procopius, the historian who had chronicled Justinian's campaigns with such precision, admitted defeat before this horror. He wrote, "But I grow dizzy when I write of such suffering, and pass on to future times its memories. For someone hardened by the blood of sieges and wars, to use such words shows the extent of despair. Violence had rules he could explain. This came without pattern, leaving him unable to describe it without dismay. Modern research has attempted to understand the disaster. Archaeologists excavating in mass graves from this period have identified bacterial traces pointing to the same pathogen later responsible for the Black Death. However, absolute certainty remains out of reach. What matters most is what contemporaries endured: sudden death, neighbors gone within hours, and entire towns unable to bury their dead. Some contemporary accounts and later estimates suggest the outbreak killed as much as a third of the population in affected areas. Regardless of the actual number, it had a devastating impact on society. The timing could hardly have been worse. Justinian had already depleted the treasury through wars in Africa and Italy, and had spent vast sums on the Hagia Sophia and other projects. Heavy taxes had barely kept the economy functioning. Now, with households wiped out, tax officials found only empty shops and abandoned farms. The state still demanded revenue, but the taxpayers had vanished. You can think of Justinian's empire as a massive engine of conquest. Fuel came from farmers in the countryside, merchants in the cities, and recruits filling the ranks. When the plague struck, that engine simply came to a halt. Troops still needed wages, supplies had to be shipped across seas, and monuments continued to consume wealth. But the gears had no power left to turn them. Demographic collapse was the harshest blow. Villages reported no men left to plow the fields. In Constantinople, observers wrote, you could walk for minutes through whole districts without seeing another soul. Markets that had once supplied spices and silks now carried weeds between bleaching stones. Farmers produced less grain, artisans fewer goods, and the army's workforce dwindled. Recruitment almost ceased in some regions, leaving generals begging for soldiers who no longer existed. What made it all the more bitter was Justinian's persistence. Even as populations fell, Italy still demanded troops. The Persians pressed at the frontier, armies marched, monuments rose, and taxes were demanded, although the foundation supporting them continued to shrink. For those who survived, every levy felt heavier, every burden more crushing. A dream of a restored empire persisted, but it rested on corpses and exhaustion. To ordinary people, despair replaced pride. The banners of Africa and Italy meant little against piles of funeral smoke. Crafts that had flourished for centuries, shipping, textiles, city markets, simply collapsed when the skilled hands that sustained them perished. Even strong institutions bent until they cracked. Tax collection failed, urban maintenance ceased, and famine stalked communities already weakened by grief. The waves of plague recurred repeatedly. Even when a brief recovery seemed possible, the next wave swept everything away. That is why visitors returning years after the first outbreak still described ghostly silences where busy crowds once gathered. Fear itself hollowed the cities as much as disease. People saw parades disappear, processions stop, and constant dread become the rhythm of life. Economically, this meant not merely strain, but collapse. Grain production decreased, trade routes weakened, and coinage vanished from circulation as labor diminished. Tax records turned blank, not because officials failed to record, but because entire populations no longer existed. Yet armies, now stretched across Africa, Italy, and the eastern frontiers, still demanded pay. Ships still consumed timber and labor. Fortifications still required stone. The state's needs persisted, but the very population that had once met them had shrunk away. From this point, Justinian's reign underwent a significant change in character. His early years were marked by ambition, as he pursued wars, monuments, and legal projects aimed at reshaping Rome's legacy. After the plague, exhaustion shaped the regime. Policy no longer announced or commanded, it merely responded. What appeared on maps as a powerful, expanding empire was, in truth, reeling from underpopulation, collapsing finances, and frayed morale. The paradox of his reign reached its sharpest point here. Justinian had forced the law of Rome back into Africa, brought Italy under his armies, and rebuilt Constantinople into a wonder. But none of that offered protection against what struck in 542. The plague revealed the fragility beneath the grandeur, a machine of empire rattling forward without strength to sustain it. And this was not just a crisis of power or economics. It was also a crisis of memory. Procopius's writing, faltering before piles of suffering he could scarcely bear to recount, became the record of a society that felt itself broken. His testimony forces us to see Justinian not only through marble and victories, but through the silence of extinguished streets. That silence prompted people to reassess the emperor himself. Was he chosen by God, as parades had declared, or cursed, as despair suggested? For some, the monuments proved his greatness. For others, the plague demonstrated divine punishment. Even among his own historians, the view of Justinian split into two distinct faces. One admired, the other reviled. It is in those conflicting accounts that we glimpse the contradictions at the heart of his rule. One emperor, two portraits, a savior restoring Rome, or a destroyer leaving an empire hollowed. That divide will shape how we interpret Justinian's legacy in the future. What happens when the man writing history cannot decide whether his emperor was the savior of Rome or its destroyer? That contradiction shapes our understanding of Justinian, as most of what we know about his reign comes from a single voice, Procopius of Caesarea. He was no distant chronicler, but an insider, secretary to Belisarius, traveling alongside campaigns, witnessing sieges, victories, and famine up close. And through his words, Justinian appears with two opposite faces, one exalted, the other monstrous. Procopius left us three major works: the wars, the buildings, and the secret history, or in Greek, the anecdota. Each offers a distinct portrait, written for a specific audience and purpose. The wars was a public history, intended for circulation and modeled on the great classical historians. It provides detailed accounts of wars against Persia, the Vandals, and the Goths. Procopius describes battlefield maneuvers, siegecraft, negotiations, and at least in its early books, Justinian and Belisarius appear capable, decisive, and often blessed with divine favor. For any reader of the wars alone, Justinian emerges as the careful architect of a restored empire. But the buildings offers another perspective, one of outright praise. Written almost like a panegyric or ceremonial ode of admiration, it enumerates the emperor's architectural achievements. The text extols the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the fortifications at frontier towns, churches in Ravenna, and shrines spread from Egypt to Thrace. Its tone borders on reverence. Justinian appears there as God's chosen architect, transforming the empire in stone. These pages gave contemporaries a sense of continuity, as if monuments could erase the scars of riot and plague. If you only read the buildings, you might think Justinian is nearly saintly. And yet, take up the secret history, written in private and never meant for immediate publication, and you encounter its darker side. Procopius holds nothing back. He describes Justinian as not merely flawed, but as a monster, tarnishing not only the emperor, but also Theodora, Belisarius, and the entire court. Its tone is bitter, scandalous, and venomous, beginning with stories that undermine Belisarius and his wife before turning on Justinian with a savage assault. Here, the emperor appears greedy, cruel, and driven by demonic lust for power. The same writer who once praised disciplined campaigns now unleashes accusations intended to shock. Some scholars suggest Procopius may have drafted parts of this, even as his public works were circulating. If so, he wrote both public praise and private vitriol simultaneously, reflecting divided loyalties and disbelief at the true costs of Justinian's policies. That leaves us with the puzzle. How can one man produce such contrasting accounts of the same ruler? Consider the contexts. The wars, designed for educated audiences, had to echo Thucydides in style, adopting what some call Olympian sorrow, when campaigns soured but never descending into open hatred. Public history required balance and dignity. The buildings, likely supported by the court, offered idealized praise during a period when Constantinople's burned-out center needed redefinition after the riots. And the secret history, its very title, Anecdota, meaning unpublished, allowed his rawest anger to be freely expressed. In that hidden book, we see the voice of a man who had lived through Italy's ruin, who had seen taxpayers squeezed until revolt became constant, and who struggled to reconcile greatness with devastation. If you read Procopius closely, you notice his tone change even within the wars. Early volumes shine with admiration for Justinian and Belisarius. Later, during the 20-year struggle in Italy, you sense hesitation, doubts, and criticism of strategies that drained cities. It feels as though his optimism gradually faded, his voice shifting from triumphant fanfare to the quiet sorrow of someone who has witnessed too much bloodshed. Then, in the secret history, restraint completely gives way to fury. However, his account does not present us with parody or satire, but with a conflicting truth. Justinian did achieve remarkable accomplishments. Vandal Africa was conquered, Ravenna was regained, and Hagia Sophia was built in gleaming stone. He also presided over devastation, countryside ravaged by Gothic war, Antioch in flames, provinces burdened by taxation, and the horror of plague. Procopius documented both aspects of this reality through various works, addressing different audiences. So, which should we trust? Which version reveals the real emperor? You might say both, because Justinian's reign itself embodied contradiction. Greatness and ruin cannot be neatly separated. His monuments rose because his tax gatherers reached deeply. His victories in Italy coincided with disaster in Syria. His laws were issued alongside death carts rolling through Constantinople's streets. When you read Procopius, you hear both the trumpet of triumph and the cry of the people who paid for it. The historian compels modern readers to hold conflicting images in mind. Picture two portraits of the same ruler. In one, the artist uses bright colors, depicting noble eyes and a faithful posture. In the other, everything is shadow, sunken skin, suspicious gaze, hands clawing at wealth. Which is the true likeness? Neither can be dismissed, yet neither tells the whole story. Only together, in their tension, do they suggest what contemporaries actually saw, a ruler who inspired both awe and dread. Why did Procopius write in this way? Some argue he was cynical, shaping his voice to suit circumstances, offering flattery when demanded by the court, and dark invective when secrecy permitted. Others believe he was simply conflicted. Living amidst the contradictions of Justinian's rule, he could not settle on a single truth without betraying his experience. His writings reflect not fabrication, but struggle. How to reconcile the glory of Constantinople with the misery of Italy, or divine majesty in Hagia Sophia with the corpses littering the streets outside. Notice, too, how Procopius's contradictions mirror the empire's own fractures. Constantinople could showcase golden processions on newly paved streets, even as villages in neighboring provinces faced starvation. The emperor could be proclaimed God's representative in the same year Antioch was lost. Splendor did not erase suffering. Both existed side by side. Procopius, through his writings, embodied that coexistence. Standing in Hagia Sophia's nave today, you might experience the same dissonance. Look upward, and the dome still gleams with light, directing your thoughts towards divine presence and imperial ambition. But imagine stepping outside in 542, into deserted streets hushed by plague smoke. The dome and the silence stand side by side, like the two voices of Procopius, each true, each incomplete without the other. Which voice convinced contemporaries? Both. Some would have believed the triumphant accounts of the wars. Others, behind closed doors, whispered the grim stories of the secret history. Each version echoed with lived experience. That is why you cannot separate them. To understand Justinian's reign, you must hold both visions together, the praise and the critique. And it is that tension that remains Procopius's greatest gift. By refusing to offer consistency, he preserved the contradictions that defined the age. His emperor is not a figure that can be neatly boxed in. He is both builder and destroyer, renewer and despoiler, a man whose power reshaped the Mediterranean but exhausted the people who carried it. To truly understand the 6th century, you must accept the double vision. See the panegyric of the buildings and the bitterness of the secret history. Observe the sober record of the wars, shifting from admiration to despair. Together, they reveal a reign impossible to reduce to either triumph or failure. And yet, amid these fractured portraits, one creation outlasted perspective. Armies faded, cities burned, and monuments cracked. But Justinian also chiseled something far sturdier, something not shaken by famine, not toppled by plague, and not dependent on Procopius's moods. That achievement endured long after swords had broken and buildings had fallen. If you want to know which work from Justinian's reign shaped the world beyond his lifetime, look not to battles fought or domes built, but to law. This was the project known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law, and it would endure where conquests and monuments did not. Commissioned by Justinian and completed within about 5 years by a legal commission, it transformed centuries of scattered rulings into a single, ordered system. In a world collapsing under war and plague, this was permanence fashioned from paper and ink. Before Justinian, Roman law had become tangled with age. Emperors issued decrees, senators passed statutes, and jurists wrote volumes of opinions. The result was more a jumble of precedents than a framework. One law contradicted another. Judges cited ancient rulings that clashed with newer ones, and no consistent standard could be enforced across the vast empire. In different provinces, the law varied. An inheritance settled in Antioch might conflict with how a will was read in Carthage. What was needed was consistency. Justinian decided to give the empire what no new fortress or campaign could: a single clear voice of law. To achieve this, he assembled a team of leading jurists and scholars. Their task was formidable: gather all the laws ever issued, prune away what was obsolete, identify contradictions, and decide which traditions deserved authority. It was like taking an overgrown forest of legal rulings and carving it into a straight, navigable road. Remarkably, the commission completed this colossal task in about 5 years, an astonishing pace, considering modern governments often take longer to revise a single tax code. The speed reflected Justinian's sense of urgency. He saw law not as mere paperwork, but as the very backbone of his empire. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, divided into 4 coordinated parts: the Codex, the Digest or Digesta, the Institutes, and the Novellae. The first 3 were written in Latin, the traditional language of Roman law, while the Novellae were primarily in Greek, the empire's everyday tongue. This detail itself hints at change. Justinian's empire preserved Roman law, but it increasingly spoke Greek, foreshadowing Byzantium's future identity. Each part played its role. The Codex organized and combined centuries of imperial laws, uniting them in a single book accessible to officials. The Digest condensed the opinions of legal experts over the centuries, called responsae. Many of these conflicted. Here, editors cut, sifted, and arranged them by subject to produce a clear, authoritative digest. The Institute served as a manual, instructing students and novices on how law was created and applied. Finally, the Novellae recorded new laws issued during Justinian's reign. Together, they provided structure to an empire where law now spoke consistently from center to frontier. The code was not abstract. It touched everyday life in detail. Property ownership, contracts, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and guardianship all found their proper place within Justinian's collection. Farmers learned exactly what rights protected their land. Traders relied on the contract's rules to guarantee they would receive payment. Families could settle wills following clear procedures. Although criminal law appeared, it was much less developed than civil law. This shows what mattered most to Byzantium. Law was not only a tool for punishment, but also a framework for economic and social stability. When you consider it, this project was a statement of philosophy as much as a collection of rules. The emperor was both master and servant of the law. He issued decrees, but also spoke as if law itself was the higher principle he served. The codification embodied this dual image. Justinian declared its supremacy, but also implied that governance was not arbitrary, that rulings came from a structure deeper than any single man. For subjects weary of capricious taxation and chaotic rule, this at least offered a promise of predictability. So, if we blame Justinian for overextending his state, we also credit him for creating a legal order that endured beyond his borders. Unlike provinces, law could not revolt, nor could plague erase texts that had already become authoritative. Conquests faded as frontiers shifted, but volumes could be copied and read centuries later. That resilience gave Justinian's law a life beyond his empire. Indeed, the reward came long after his reign had ended. By the medieval period, scholars in Italy rediscovered the Corpus Juris Civilis. Universities made it central to their teaching, and monarchs across Europe relied on its principles to justify their power. Nobles studied contract law based on Justinian's compilation, and courts revived property law rooted in the Digest. The principles persisted through the centuries, shaping doctrines that underpin European law today. Think of the contrast. Justinian's conquest of Africa disappeared within years of his death. Italy, the prize of his Gothic wars, soon slipped away. Antioch, once a flourishing city, lay in ruins after a Persian assault. Even the Hagia Sophia, for all its grandeur, is a monument tied to a single age and place. But the legal code proved portable. Copied into manuscripts, taught in classrooms, applied in courts, It carried forward into realms he could never imagine. That is why historians often say law was his true legacy, not the empire he sought to rebuild, but the institutions he codified. The endurance of the Corpus Juris Civilis demonstrates that law is stronger than conquest. Conquered territories have borders. Borders may shift, but the principles of obligation, property, and contract endure across frontiers. Even today, echoes of Justinian's framing of obligation or inheritance resonate through modern courts when judges resolve disputes. You may not hear his name in every contract signed, but many fundamental principles are rooted in his work. What makes this most remarkable is its remarkable adaptability. In Constantinople, the code fit seamlessly into an already bureaucratic environment that valued order, yet it also endured beyond that context. When medieval kings sought legitimacy, they found it in Justinian's law. Renaissance scholars turned to his codification when seeking foundations of authority. When modern nation-states developed their legal codes, they incorporated principles first systematized under his direction. The law that began within one fragile empire eventually became universal beyond it. This reveals the core of Justinian's reign. His armies reclaimed provinces but failed to hold them. His architecture amazed but merely defied short-term dangers. His laws, compiled under pressure, persisted through centuries. While armies gained and lost land repeatedly, Justinian's law traveled across eras, his most lasting act of empire. However, this triumph of permanence could not shield Byzantium from the vulnerability of the present. The empire that produced the Corpus Juris Civilis faltered under the weight of wars, debts, and plague. Provinces were stretched thin, armies divided, and frontiers insecure. A ruler seeking to revive an ancient empire unwittingly left it open to new forces lurking just beyond his view. In those weaknesses, history prepared its next move. The very emperor who envisioned reviving Rome left behind a state distracted, drained, and exposed. From those cracks, something unforeseen would emerge, shaping not only Byzantium but the world that followed. What if the struggle to restore Rome indirectly created conditions that, decades later, allowed a new world religion to spread across Byzantium's borders? This irony lies at the heart of Justinian's reign. His attempt to recover lost provinces and crown his dynasty with splendor seemed logical within his vision, but the costs left Byzantium drained, overstretched, and unstable. The campaigns drained troops, the plague wiped out populations, and the grand projects exhausted funds. Together, these pressures meant that by the mid-6th century, the empire appeared large, but was actually fragile. This fragility would prove significant when a new force began to emerge. The sharpest weakness Justinian left was geographical. By centering his ambitions on Africa, Sicily, and Italy, he diverted men and ships from the east. Yet, the eastern frontier was the empire's vital zone, facing Persia across the Euphrates. Antioch had already fallen to the Sasanians during his reign, shocking proof that expansion in the west rendered the heartland vulnerable. The reconquered provinces appeared glorious on maps, but they were difficult to maintain. The east remained the frontier of survival, and Justinian never provided it with the guard it needed. The plague then intensified the strain. When harvests withered and towns emptied, the tax base contracted, and armies struggled to find recruits. This meant Africa and Italy, provinces that required constant supply lines and long garrisons, were not assets, but burdens. Soldiers stationed far away drained resources just as populations at home collapsed. Byzantium had regained the contours of the Roman Mediterranean, but lacked the people to sustain them. Into this tense world stepped a new force. Within a generation after Muhammad died in 632, Arab armies, united by shared faith and expert in desert warfare, surged out of the Arabian Peninsula. Their rise was not sudden chaos. They had been united by a new religious movement that provided purpose and cohesion. But their conquests were only possible because the two major powers of the region, Byzantium and Persia, had been fought almost to exhaustion. Byzantium's defenses were flimsy. Its cities had been ravaged by plague. When the Arabs arrived in Syria, the empire had little reserve left to resist. Arab expansion built on a perfect storm that Justinian's policies had helped create. His reconquests drained resources from the east. His building programs, like the Hagia Sophia, depleted treasuries. His empire was already weakened when disease struck. Byzantium staggered through the following decades, presenting exactly the sort of weakened frontier that allowed a new movement to surge. Religious zeal drove this surge, but passion alone did not explain the rapid success. The Arab armies combined fervor with pragmatism. Unlike traditional conquerors, they did not always enforce immediate conversion. Conquered communities, especially Christians and Jews, were often allowed to retain their property and practice their religion, as long as they paid taxes. These included the jizya, a head tax on non-Muslims, and land taxes. It was both coercion and tolerance simultaneously, but it made Arab rule administratively appealing. Local populations, long burdened by Byzantine levies or caught between rival empires, sometimes viewed this new order as less disruptive than ongoing war. This helped stabilize Arab authority in newly conquered lands. That combination, zeal, desert warfare skills, and pragmatic rule, enabled regions to be integrated quickly. Provinces weakened by Byzantine neglect were absorbed within a few years. Syria fell first, followed by Egypt, and then North Africa. The speed of these conquests surprised observers. For centuries, Byzantium had presented itself as the successor of Rome and the master of the Mediterranean. Now, less than a century after Muhammad's death, Arab forces had driven the empire back into a defensive stance. The irony is striking. Justinian aimed to stabilize Byzantium through structural reforms, including churches, fortifications, and codified law. He sought legitimacy through reconquest, regaining Gothic, Vandal, and Berber territories. Yet, those very victories ultimately weakened the empire in the long run. By the time the Arabs appeared, those great prizes had become burdens. His victories did not safeguard his successors. They overextended them. The contrast becomes clear when you compare his cultural monuments with the military outcomes. Hagia Sophia still stands as a testament to the ambition of his reign. His law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, spread across Europe and shaped legal codes for centuries. However, the empire itself, which seemed to be reborn, quickly lost ground once the Arabs advanced. Syria and Egypt had vanished by the mid-7th century. These provinces had supported tax and grain supplies since Roman times. Without them, Byzantium would have become peripheral rather than central. For Byzantium, the 7th century revealed a sobering truth. It did not collapse entirely, but contracted into a smaller, more rigid shape, centered on Anatolia and the Balkans. It fought merely to survive rather than to dominate. Africa slipped away, and Italy soon followed, resulting in diminished revenues. Justinian's vision of a reunited Mediterranean order disintegrated. Yet remarkably, some of his institutions outlasted this retreat. His legal code, written in Latin but later supplemented in Greek, was adopted into Western schools and courts. Within this lie the paradoxes of his legacy: lands lost, laws preserved, an empire diminished, yet intellectual foundations carried forward. It is helpful to view Justinian's reign as soil prepared for two different crops. One was his legal and architectural achievements, which flourished in Europe and lasted for centuries. The other was weakness, cultivated by overreach and plague, which others reaped. The Arab armies did not create that weakness, but they exploited it swiftly. What appeared to be Rome's rebirth had, in fact, hollowed out its successor state and laid the groundwork for a different world. The rise of Islam signified more than new opponents. It meant that the Mediterranean Justinian sought to reclaim was no longer the same stage. A new political and religious unity emerged, stretching from Arabia to Spain, transforming trade, communication, and the balance of power. The world Justinian believed he was restoring shifted into one where Byzantium was no longer at the center. Therefore, Justinian's greatest triumphs also contributed to hollowing the buffers Byzantium relied on, making a new religious and political order feasible. His reconquests and monuments dazzled his contemporaries, but their costs shaped the centuries that followed. And this raises the question we must ask about his reign as a whole. When the empire expands, does it grow stronger, or does it sow the seeds of its own decline? Justinian's reconquest appeared like a triumph, but it drained his empire from within. By deploying forces into Africa and Italy, he left the East vulnerable. But this came at a terrible price. Overextension and neglect of the Persian frontier carved the very wounds his successors could not close. His true legacy lay not in those conquests, but in what endured: his law, which outlasted the empire itself. You've seen how short-term glory can weaken long-term strength.